Hello, everyone. Before we get into today's episode, we have a quick little announcement we'd like to make. We've started a video series over on our YouTube channel called The Crisis, where we take a look at Britain's 1931 financial crisis on a week-by-week and sometimes day-by-day basis. The third episode just came out earlier today, so if you'd like to check that out, there is a link to our YouTube channel down in the description below. As well as that, we'd like to, as always, thank our patrons, including our executive producers, Justus, Ebel, Jeremy Marcoux, Tom McCool, and Tony Turrin for all their support. And now, on with the episode. You all know the story, right? One of the greatest armies the world has ever seen, with superior training, tactics, and equipment, sweep away a cowardly, underprepared enemy who cower uselessly in fortresses that their enemies simply drive around. That's the popular version of the story of the fall of France in 1940. But what if it was wrong? What if French resistance was undermined by generals who sought to use military setbacks to bring about regime change? What if it underplays the French and overplays the German strengths? What if it also neglects the significance of 1940 for world history? It's time to correct the narrative of the fall of France in the summer of 1940. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another very special episode of History's Most. My name is Peter.
And I'm Alex, and it's my pleasure today to say that we are joined by Dr. Chris Millington, a historian of modern French history and the author of France in the Second World War. Thank you for joining us, Chris.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Today we're going to look at one of, perhaps it's fair to say, overlooked aspects of the Second World War, despite it being one of the most significant events of the Second World War. We're going to look at the fall of France. And of course, it's kind of almost in, if you were to split up the Second World War into a neat story format, it's kind of in the setup, in the Act One. To explain the rest of the Second World War, you've got to have Germany in control of kind of continental Europe. And it's almost kind of brushed over in that sense. But hopefully today we're going to really get into it and why it happened, why it was so significant, and also address some of the myths. So we're indebted to Chris for coming and helping us to do that today. Building on kind of what I've just been saying then, first of all, Chris, why this topic in terms of something that you've spent a lot of time studying and writing about? Why is it so significant, do you think, in 20th century history?
Well, it tends to be, just from a more general point of view, it tends to be one of the things that most people know happened in the Second World War. Most British people, certainly, who I've spoken to, when I explain to them that I'm a French historian, they usually bring up the fact that France was defeated in 1940, probably because it makes the British look better than the French. So I think that for me is significant because of all the things that I look at. It's one of the things most known about in English-speaking culture. But in terms of the history itself, firstly, the immediate significance of the defeat is, I think we need to understand that France is the second largest empire in the world at this time. So this war that begins in 1939, it's a war of empires. France governs 5% of the world's population, so about 110 million subjects, which is a lot smaller than the British Empire, but nevertheless, it's the second largest. And so this defeat in 1940 affects people around the world. It's a huge shock as well because France is a global power. France is seen to have this formidable army, and this army collapses really within 6 weeks of the German invasion. And because France has collapsed, it seems very likely in 1940 that Britain will collapse too. And that informs a lot of what goes on in France after the defeat, and why a lot of French people support this authoritarian regime that replaces the democratic regime in France. But as you say, it sets up also the rest of the Second World War. So not only for France, so it sets up the occupation of France. It sets up the resistance to the occupation, and this has important effects after the war in France, because the whole of post-war France is built on the resistance to the occupation. But it also sets up the fact that the European powers won't be able to defeat Nazi Germany on their own. So Britain, I know Britain has this huge empire, but we could argue that this defeat of France shows that eventually Britain will need American support, and also Soviet support, although I know at this time the Soviet Union is allied with Nazi Germany. And so some historians have argued, and it's not necessarily French historians who argue this, that this is a turning point in the 20th century, that everything that comes afterwards, such as things like the bipolar world order during the Cold War, the formation of the European Economic Community in the 50s, you can trace it back to this defeat of France, and the fact that Britain and France can no longer do things on their own. Now, I admit that might be reading a lot into the fact that France lost the battle in 1940, but I think nevertheless, I think it's interesting to give it some thought, even if we can't discount all the multiple things that happened and developments after that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, because I'd never really thought about it, but from that point of view of 1940 being, well, it's famously, the phrase the American century, that, USA comes to dominate the 20th century world. But perhaps that this is the moment where the old powers, Britain and France, leave the stage kind of thing, and the baton is passed, as you say, to the Soviet Union and the United States.
Yes, and in terms of the empire too, the French Empire, it sort of signals to these colonial nationalists who oppose the French Empire, and doubtless the ones who oppose the British Empire, that the European powers aren't infallible. They can be defeated militarily. They can be kind of knocked back on their heels. And this gives great inspiration to nationalists throughout the French Empire. And as I say, it's an example to anti-British nationalists too, because we shouldn't forget, and I'll probably bang on about this point throughout the episode, is that this is an Allied defeat. It's not a French defeat. Yes, France falls, but it is an Allied force in France. And so if we're talking about the defeat in 1940, we need to talk about the British defeat of 1942. I know even at the time and since then, it's been reframed as a heroic retreat to Dunkirk and back across the Channel, was a humiliation for Britain as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's that it's probably the bit that isn't quoted very often from the Churchill speech, but he does call what happened in France a colossal military disaster, of which, also from the British perspective, there's probably few military disasters as bad as what happens in France in May and June 1940. And I also, what you were saying there struck me as just as well, just thinking about the kind of decolonisation that comes after the war and the link to that. Because, of course, with the example of France, I'm just thinking, and this isn't an area of my own expertise, but I'm just thinking about, Indochina or Vietnam and Algeria come really hot on the heels of the end of the Second World War, don't they?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and the wartime situation does influence that. In terms of Algeria, this Algerian war for independence begins in the mid-50s, but partly the experience of the war says to these Algerian nationalists that we could maybe get rid of the French, but also the experience of the war shows that the French are also no less determined to hold on to their colonial territories. And in fact, on the 8th of May 1945, when everyone is celebrating in Europe, the French massacre tens of thousands of Algerians who are protesting against colonial rule. So it shows really that the French haven't changed, and the French are not prepared to give any ground to these colonial nationalists, which only fuels their desire for independence even more.
Absolutely. The other thing that is quite striking, as well as its obvious historical import, is that the fall of France in 1940 is a very mythologized, or as you've kind of mentioned at the start, has a strong cultural resonance, particularly, I would say, in Britain, and I'm sure obviously also in France. And it's kind of created a whole, a joke on the French surrendering and but French being cowardly. A kind of stereotype has sprung out of it, hasn't it? Which is kind of something, a kind of popular culture kind of consequence of this as well.
Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, so the ones that I am most aware of in popular culture, and this probably gives away my age, is the Simpsons. In 1995, the French are called surrender monkeys, which is a phrase that's revived at the time of the Iraq War in the early 2000s, when the US press uses it again to condemn the French for not taking part in the invasion of Iraq. And also in the same year, in 2003, there's the development of this Google bomb, where if you search on Google for French military victories, it returns no results, and asks, do you mean French military defeats? Which I have just tried doing that again, and it doesn't have the same effect anymore. So yes, it's seeped into popular culture that the French are cowards, that the French are not very good at fighting battles, that the French run away, really. Now, this is one of the most frustrating myths that I come across in my work, because obviously I'm a Francophile and I want to defend the French. And so we have this idea that the French gave up, but interestingly, that comes about pretty much at the same time as the defeat. So there's a couple of journalists in France writing in 1940, a very famous American journalist, William Shirer, who writes that the French didn't have any will to fight, even when they'd been invaded, that the French soul, he writes, had collapsed completely upon the invasion. And then there's a British journalist who writes for the Manchester Guardian, Alexander Wirth, who describes seeing just French soldiers looking demoralized and drunk. They're a routed army. They look ragged and tired, and there's no fight left in them. So this idea comes about pretty much immediately, and I think in part it helps to explain away the immediacy of the defeat. So this is such a shocking event that there must be something inherently wrong with the French that this has happened so quickly. Now, interestingly, at the same time, we have on the other side the idea that this is a German blitzkrieg, that this is a meticulously planned invasion that has completely knocked out France. Now, that is a myth as well, because that was also propagated quite strangely by the Allies, again, in an effort to explain why they had been defeated so quickly. So the Allies are looking around for reasons to explain this stunning military collapse. And so they say, oh, well, the Germans, they're just much better. They're better armed. They've planned this better. And also the French, they never wanted to fight it in the first place. So I think for me, it's fascinating to look at how these myths develop at the time, really, on the ground, and then carry on into post-war culture. but I think in post-war culture, it's more really a stick to beat the French with in the English-speaking world.
You're probably right there. Just one of the things that struck me actually when you were reading those journalistic quotes was that they could probably just as easily be applied to the BEF at Dunkirk in terms of a ragged army that was in all sorts of trouble. But one thing actually that intrigued me there when you're talking about how many people, even in 1940, were kind of talking about the French just don't have a will to fight. How much did the memory of the Great War, of course, the one thing that probably France was remembered for was its will to fight, they shall not pass kind of thing. That was obviously in very recent living memory. So did those two kind of popular images interact at all, or did one just supersede the other?
Yes, there's a very strong memory of the First World War, and something to be aware of is that the First World War seems to, from my point of view, have a much greater impact in France than in Britain, and today even because the French don't really have this heroic story of the Second World War. It's often the heroism of the First World War that they go back to. So France loses over 1 million men in the First World War, and it does bring about genuine horror that the French don't want to fight another war. They especially don't want the battlefield to be in France, which partly informs the military tactics in 1940. And there is a very vocal pacifist movement in France during the interwar years. Now, again, in 1940, this is a factor that is blamed for the defeat. And even the French army command blame pacifists. They partly blame these political pacifist movements, but they also blame school teachers as well for spreading left-wing pacifist ideas throughout France. And so France has raised a generation that doesn't want to fight. It's just an excuse. It's a way to deflect blame from the army. Although you have this vocal pacifist movement in France, and France supports appeasement, no one in France wants to be defeated by Germany. They will accept war if it's imposed upon them, as they did in 1914, but they're not willing to accept peace at any price. And actually, by 1938 and 1939, the French are becoming a lot more confident in opposing Hitler and Mussolini and saying to the British, we won't give any more concessions to these powers. So I think it's easy to think that the experience of the First World War means that no one wanted to fight anymore. And that's certainly a myth that's propagated at the time. But the French know what Hitler is like. They know what the Nazis will do in France. They know what Hitler has written about France, that France is the hereditary enemy. And they know that because Mein Kampf was illegally published in France to spread the opposition to the Nazis. So when 1940 occurs and the invasion happens, it's not a case of the fact that they just lay down their weapons and pull out the white flags.
No, quite. Well, that's kind of what we're going to get into now, I think. We're going to explore in some detail this story because, as I say, it's almost, despite it being one of the most significant events of the Second World War, it's almost skirted over. It's almost like, well, in the traditional narrative of the war, so if you can say that exists, but, the Germans invade and France has fallen in 6 weeks. And there we go. Now we've got the situation that's set up for the kind of rest of the war. But let's kind of get into the detail, I think, because that's a really important story to tell, particularly if we want to dispel some of those myths that we've mentioned before. So, of course, the war starts in September 1939 with the German invasion of Poland, and famously, the Allies, Britain and France, don't do very much. They kind of sit on a defensive stance through the winter of 1939-40. What was the kind of thinking there, and what were the consequences of it?
Well, you're right. The French don't really want to take the initiative, although they favour taking the initiative more so than the British, actually. But so you have this phony war in France, in which the French mobilise their army and go and send them to northeast France, where they just sit around, get very cold, and the after the defeat, this is also one of the things that is blamed, that the soldiers had nothing to do. They were bored, and defeatism spread, and their enthusiasm declined. Um, but all this time, France is continuing to rearm. So French rearmament really takes off in 1939, and I know that sounds very late to be rearming. But the rearmament program was begun in the mid-30s, and France eventually ends up spending about a third of its, or the government spends a third of all money on armaments prior to the invasion. And by 1941, actually, France is on target to outstrip Germany in producing arms. Unfortunately, they're beaten before then. So the French they control the Allies, the Allied force in the country. So it's a French general who is at the top of the Supreme Allied Command, General Maurice Gamelin, his name is. Now, although it's a Frenchman there, we should recognise that the British also agree to what the French decide will be the plan. Whether they agree to this because they know they're not really going to commit fully to the fight or not, some historians have argued that. But if we look at the actual invasion of France, it begins on the 10th of May, 1940, and they have this plan in place which Gamelin has helped to devise, and it's called Plan D. Plan D. And it essentially involves moving the best British and French troops north into Belgium. Because, as I've said previously, the French don't want to fight in France. They don't want the northeast destroyed again. So the idea is we'll move all our best troops into Belgium. That's where the Germans are going. And we'll stop them before they get to the French border. And this is what happens. So they send scores of divisions of troops into Belgium, and they post further south kind of their least well-equipped, least well-trained men. They post these men south of the Maginot Line. So the Maginot Line is this network of forts which is along the French border, which is thought to be this kind of a technological marvel for the time. And there's a lot of faith placed in the Maginot Line. And south of the Maginot Line, they place these largely less well-trained, less well-equipped reservists. Unfortunately, that's where the Germans come. So they come through this region called the Ardennes, which is thought to be a natural barrier to invasion because of the landscape there. And so what happens then is the Germans move the minority of their force north in, it's been called the Matador's cloak, like a feint into Belgium, where they face these crack British and French and all their allied nations troops, and they send the majority of their men through the Ardennes. So we have these 45 divisions of German troops opposing 18 divisions of French troops. So it's a real weak point in the Allied lines. And it's only within a few days of that the French and the British realised, and this is how I explain the defeat of France to my students: we've put our men in the wrong place. There's no one there of any worth to defend this.
It's kind of as simple as that. It's both numbers, well, overwhelming numbers, and superiority in terms of the quality and the training of these particular troops that are these second-rate troops that are posted kind of there. I
Yes.
did want to ask about the Maginot Line, because that's another thing that, again, with hindsight and with, again, what you would call the traditional narrative of the war, it's seen as this great folly. The French waste so much time, money, effort, energy, and indeed, it kind of somehow dilutes their military prowess as well, that they focus just on a chain of fortifications that are going to prevent invasion ever happening. Is that a too simplistic, too caricatured almost view of it?
Yes, I think so. Yes, it does have this. Well, there's the phrase the Maginot mentality, that the French are so obsessed with defense that they just sort of sit back and let the Germans come towards them and invade. But when we actually, if you actually look at sketches and drawings and photographs of these Maginot Line forts, they are, as I said, a technological marvel. They could sustain thousands of men underground for months. There are electric railways connecting them. There's all sorts of facilities for the soldiers to live in. And one of the things that is perhaps not necessarily widely known about the Maginot Line is it was actually intended to support ground attacks. So it was meant to provide artillery and forts to support infantry moving forward. So, of course, after the war, or after 1940, it's seen as this expensive, as you say, expensive folly that distracted them from building more conventional weapons. But there's great hope placed in the Maginot Line, and the forts, the ones that were attacked by the Germans, they did hold out. So the Maginot Line forts didn't fall. In fact, when the Germans are retreating back to Germany in 1944 and 1945, they use some of the forts to support their own defense. So I think the Maginot Line has a bit of a bad reputation, really.
Yeah. What do you think about the Ardennes? Because obviously that's a gigantic operational misstep, in that the Allies put their best troops in the wrong place, fail to recognize where the Germans are going to push, and think that it's obviously a dense forested region.
Mm.
And they thought that their calculations that no major offensive could be launched there because of the landscape. Why did they make such an error, and why didn't they kind of see it coming? Did they not? Was it a failure of intelligence to identify where the Germans were concentrating?
Yeah, well, I suppose strangely, the original German plan was to invade through Belgium, as the Allies had predicted. But these plans fell into the hands of the Allies. And so the Germans were forced to rethink what they were going to do. And it was only then that they decided we'll go south through the Ardennes. Now, in 1938, the French army had run, I suppose, in modern terms, we call it a simulation about what would happen if the Germans attacked through the Ardennes. The two problems with this simulation were firstly, well, the biggest problem was it was dismissed as very unlikely. The second problem was that they estimated it would take the Germans 10 days to fight their way through the Ardennes. However, it took them 60 hours to get through. So they very much underestimated this natural barrier, or overestimated its defensive capabilities. And in 1940, in May, when the Germans are moving towards the Ardennes, it seems strange to think that this is a huge army on the move. Didn't anyone see it? And in fact, there were armored vehicles stretching back, and it's very difficult for me to get my head around this number, stretching back 400 kilometers going towards the Ardennes. But the Allies just weren't watching it. And the few reports that seeped through about this massive movement, they were just dismissed as, well, that is the feint. The real attack is in Belgium. So the Germans are trying to trick us. And so the Allies do have intelligence about the Ardennes. But it's just it's just an incredibly, and this is an understatement, an incredibly unfortunate mistake that they make.
It's just a sheer blunder, I suppose. One thing as well, so we'll kind of get further along the kind of storyline in a minute, if you see what I mean. Where we've got the Germans punching through the Ardennes, hitting the Allies where they're weakest, suddenly going outflanking the best of the Allied troops. Before we then get into the kind of chaos that unfolds, I think it's worth for a moment as well thinking about the kind of respective qualities of the two armies, because again, I keep using the phrase, but the way the war is perceived is that the German army of 1939, 1940, even 1941 is this formidable, unstoppable military machine. You know, the years of blitzkrieg, as it's been remembered, with its kind of armored warfare, with aerial superiority. But at the same time, I can't remember where, maybe in the World at War documentary, but it's oft repeated line that the French army in 1940 was the finest army in the world. So what was the kind of respective qualities of the two sides? Because those two things seem almost incompatible, don't they?
Yes, yeah. So yeah, to some extent, it's a post 1940 reading of it. So if we took Germany, for example, as I mentioned, this idea of the blitzkrieg, this carefully planned invasion, it depends a lot on luck, actually, that the Germans get through where they do. And a lot of the German advance through the south, once they've broken through the Ardennes, is improvised. So because their vehicles are moving so quickly that the orders from the German high command can't get to them in time. So the German tanks led by Guderian, they advance hundreds of kilometers into French territory without the order to do so. So it's not necessarily well planned, and also the German army mainly invades France, the infantry on foot, and they still use horses to transport equipment, thousands of horses. So although we have lots of these armored vehicles coming and panzers and things like that, the German army is not necessarily this ultra modern mechanized force that we think it might be in 1940. At the same time, on the French side, they do have some good all-round armored vehicles. And actually, some of their tanks, the B tanks, can withstand anti-tank shells. So the problem the French have is that a lot of their vehicles aren't connected by radio. So it's very difficult to communicate in the field, and that's where a lot of things break down for the French. It's actually just on the ground in the battlefield. There's a lack of communication. So I think we shouldn't necessarily think that either the French army is the best or the German army is the best. If we think of them as I suppose the best way of thinking of them is mid 20th century armies with a lot of sort of 19th century equipment and methods hanging over them, such as the use of horses, the use of railways to move troops and machinery to.
Yeah, I think I can't remember where I heard it, but when Germany invades the Soviet Union in 1941, they take more horses than Napoleon did in 1812. So it is kind of remarkable the extent to which our images, and another thing is that our images come from, documentaries, things like this, which are from propaganda footage that was recorded at the time. Yeah. It's not real footage of battles most of the time. It is propaganda footage of columns of tanks going along that was used to create a certain image. But nevertheless, the German armored breakthrough through the Ardennes happens, and as you said, they advance hundreds of miles kind of in an ad hoc nature. catching the Allies completely off guard. So what happens next?
Well, so the Germans come through the Ardennes and they get across the Meuse River on the 13th of May. So this is only 3 days after the invasion has started. And the Meuse River is again seen as this natural barrier that needs to be held. So by the 15th of May, they've broken through French lines. And Winston Churchill speaks to the French Prime Minister. And I've always thought, imagine listening to this phone call, because the French Prime Minister says to Churchill, "We've lost." And that's 5 days after the invasion. And I just think, well, what did Churchill think when he heard that France, the French Empire, has lost the battle within 5 days? And the reason Prime Minister, the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud says they've lost is because there is no strategic reserve, so there are no reinforcements. Again, when Churchill asks, "Where's your reserves?" He's told they're in Belgium. So there is nothing really to stop the Germans encircling the Allied forces, and the Germans get to the Channel coast on the 19th of May, which means that they've encircled over 2 million soldiers between Belgium and this thrust through the Ardennes and through France. And then it's within a few days that Operation Dynamo is launched to get the British, and we should say some French, back across the Channel. Now, the reason that the Germans also can advance so far is because there is no plan B. So when news that the Germans have broken through reaches the Allied Supreme Command, there are reports of French generals just crying because they're paralyzed. They don't know what to do. They just collapse, literally and metaphorically. And the only idea that they have is to try and plug the holes in the French line. But what this means is that they spend a lot of energy and a lot of manpower and a lot of fuel trying to plug these small gaps in the lines when they should have just retreated en masse to establish a new line. So the defeat of France really, I think, can be explained by these major strategic errors on the battlefield. Firstly, by moving their troops to Belgium, and secondly, by trying to plug these lines in what they called it the strategy of the continuous front. And the battle really is lost by the time June comes around. So the government leaves Paris because Paris is being bombed. On the 10th of June, Italy gets in on the action and declares war on France when Mussolini senses that something might be won from the French. But the Italian troops don't fare very well against the French troops. And I think this is an interesting contrast, that the French troops in the Alps hold out against the Italian invasion because they are less under the command of the Supreme Allied Command, and there is more autonomy down there. But really, by the 10th of June, when Italy declares war, there are people in French government, including Marshal Pétain, Philippe Pétain, who are beginning to think, well, how can we save ourselves now? And when I say save ourselves, I mean, how can we save the army?
One thing that strikes me is that, this massive encirclement the Germans pull off in, I think you said 9 days, to trap the vast majority of the Allied forces, including all of their best troops, in Belgium. I think, did you say 2 million, which is a hell of a pocket. And of course, it results in the famous story of Dunkirk, etc. Was there never a kind of, was there a moment, I know this is a bit of counterfactual and historians have different views whether how far you can go with counterfactuals, but was there any alternative option? Was there a time when they could have done something? Because the German armored advance as it was just begging to be cut off, to be nipped in the bud. The panzers were so far ahead of the infantry. Would it have been possible, do you think, at any point to have turned what turned into an Allied disaster could have been turned into a German disaster?
Yeah, there is a plan to launch a counterattack and cut the head off this thrust of the Germans towards the Channel. It's called the Vagon plan, after the French general Maxime Vagon, who took over at Supreme Allied Command midway through May. But it's never really seriously considered, partly because of the desperateness of the situation, but also because Vagon, and unfortunately for the fact that he is the Supreme Allied Commander, is essentially a defeatist. And he is one of the people working in the French cabinet behind the scenes, pressuring the Prime Minister to seek an armistice. So there may have been other options, I suppose, but and perhaps with other men in charge, it may have been possible. But I think by the time those things are being considered, it is such a rout that no one really knows what is happening on the battlefield itself.
It almost kind of reminds me of, an awful lot of battles in the pre-modern age are a kind of test of strength, a test of nerves, and then a rout. And the rout is where the killing happens and the decisiveness of the battle is, and you often see casualty figures for battles, as I say, pre the 19th century, where one side suffers like 100 and the other side suffers 5,000, whatever, because it's all about the rout. And is that kind of dynamic playing out here? Once it becomes a rout, the momentum of the rout means nothing else can change. That is it. The battle is decided.
I think so, yes. But I think in the case of France, what we also have to add in is that these things going on politically as well. So perhaps if you had men in government who had decided that, no, we are going to fight on to the last man, maybe there may have been some way of turning this around. But as I said, Vagon and Pétain in the cabinet, Pétain is actually the deputy prime minister until mid-June. They both support an armistice because they want to preserve the honor of the army. They don't want the army to be defeated. And they're looking to shift the blame onto the civilian government, so the politicians. And when on the 13th of June, Pétain says in the cabinet that he wants an armistice with Germany, well, it's difficult to underestimate the prestige that Pétain has in France. After the First World War, he's this war hero. He's a marshal of the army. He's known as the victor of Verdun, who turned it around in 1916 for the French. He's seen as the embodiment of France. And when he says we need to come to terms with Germany, the Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, feels he can't do anything, and he resigns. And Pétain is appointed Prime Minister. This is very significant because then Pétain goes on the radio to announce that he is seeking an end to hostilities with Germany. So he's not saying stop fighting. He's saying we're just going to start talks with Germany on the 17th of June. But nevertheless, over 1 million French soldiers give themselves up because Pétain has said that the end is coming and there's going to be an armistice. Maybe if he hadn't have done that, maybe they would have carried on fighting. But the Germans take over 1 million prisoners of war who are then held in camps throughout the war because the defeatist Pétain is now in charge of the country. So I think there is a rout on the battlefield, and there was great confusion on the battlefield about what to do, and even where people were on the battlefield, where were the units and divisions. But we've got this defeatism in government that is this like key ingredient as to why the French ultimately put their weapons down.
One of the things that's intriguing to me there is the source of that defeatism. So you had as we said, the Prime Minister telling Churchill after 5 days that we're going to lose, and you painted a clear picture there of Pétain and Vagon's just outright kind of well, as you say, defeatism. Why? Why were they not willing? That's not the right word. Obviously, they didn't want to lose, and that's something you said before. But why did the defeatism set in so quickly?
Well, I think to understand this, we need a bit of context to the interwar years. So the political regime in France of the interwar years is the Third Republic. It's a democratic regime founded in 1870. Throughout the interwar years, and especially during the 1930s, it is very unstable in terms of coalition government. So a point of comparison might be the Weimar Republic, where you have lots of prime ministers coming and going, governments coming and going, and none of them seem to be able to solve the economic crisis that has hit France during the Depression. And the economic crisis in France actually lasts longer than in other European countries. So it's only in 1938 that the economy begins to recover. So there is a lot of opposition to the Third Republic in 1930s France. There is opposition particularly from the right and the extreme right. And there are large fascist movements in France who propose an authoritarian solution to the crisis. And when I say large, I mean they can call on over 1 million supporters and followers. And so while Pétain is not a fascist and Vagon is not a fascist, they do not particularly or they are not particularly enamored with the Republic or with democracy, particularly Vagon. And so when this happens in 1940, I think they start to believe two things. Firstly, this is all the Republic's fault. This is 20 years of instability and crisis and weakness has led us to what they often called the abyss. And you can understand why they thought that, because there were lots of opponents of the Republic in the 30s saying, look, we're going towards disaster. Look at Hitler and Mussolini, they are strong men. We have weak democratic prime ministers. So it's very easy for them to think, this is all the Republic's fault. This has got long-term causes. We can't possibly fight back with these things, these problems in French society. We need a new start. We need a new France based on the honor of the army. And so the best way to safeguard the honor of the army and safeguard the future of France is to accept defeat and come to terms with Hitler. And I think the second thing that they begin to believe, particularly Vagon and the people who oppose the Republic, is that now is our chance. And in fact, some opponents of the Republic call the defeat, they call it the divine surprise, that at last the Republic can be swept away and we can implement our own agenda. So I think that's why defeatism spreads, and it's in hindsight it's a mistake to invite these people into cabinet, but everything is clear with hindsight.
Of course, yeah. There's a couple of aspects I want to pick up on from that. We'll talk about, it's almost like a kind of fifth column, isn't it, in a way, the people at the highest level actually wanting to take advantage of defeat to create something new. I want to dwell for a moment, though, on Pétain, who, today is a kind of, well, can correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't really know about his reputation in France, but he's kind of a villain in the sense that he's seen as a arch collaborator. And obviously he's becomes the head of the state of the Vichy regime, which we might get onto. But he had come out of the First World War as France's kind of greatest hero, even more so possibly than Foch. And to me, it kind of it reminds me or puts me in mind of Paul von Hindenburg in Germany as just kind of an irreproachable symbol of the nation and of Germanness, and of course, with that came with very disastrous consequences for Germany in 1933. Do you think Pétain's role is really central. And is it because of this sense that you talked about 1 million people surrendering on his speech, because he's seen as such the voice of the nation, is him being amongst these defeatists really central to France losing in 1940?
Yes, it certainly is. Yes, as you say, when he announces to the nation that he will seek an armistice, if we think about the situation of France at this time, the people are aware that the battle is going badly. If not, it's been lost. There is a huge movement of refugees in France at this time. So 8 million people are moving south through France to escape the battle zone. This is called the Exodus. So there are people who just leave their homes with whatever they can carry and are on the road. And so when this very grandfatherly figure, because he's 84 years old in 1940, who is a war hero, who is seen to be above politics because firstly, he's thought to represent just the French national interest, whatever that means to people. But secondly, he's kept out of politics in the interwar years. So he serves briefly as Minister for War in 1934, but he doesn't really make any political statements. There are lots of groups who try to appropriate his image, including Republicans. So he is described by some people in the 30s as the Republican Marshal, because it's quite ambiguous what his politics are. And so if you can imagine in summer 1940, when all these terrible things have happened, this man comes on the radio and says, I'm going to look after you. He says he's going to give the gift of his person to France. It's a very Catholic language of sacrificing himself for the nation. And it's a reassuring voice in the middle of all this chaos. If I was there, I might think, oh, well, thank goodness Pétain has come to save us. Everything they said about the Republic was true. Whatever Pétain says is good for France, must be good for France. And that helps to explain, I think, some of the defeatism in France, but it also helps to explain why the French accepted the end of the Republic as well.
It really does. The more you talked about it, that makes me think about Hindenburg, because there's this vision of him as being totally above politics, of only having Germany in his interests. And I thought particularly the way you talked about Pétain being anyone who wants to think Pétain represents them.
Yes, yeah.
Hindenburg was exactly the same. He was both the guardian of the Republic and also, the leader of the nationalist right. One thing as well, before we get to the kind of what happens next in France because of the defeat, to what extent is this an Allied defeat? We've talked about the French aspects a lot there. Are there failures on the part of, well, it's primarily the British, isn't it, that lead to this being such a catastrophe?
Yes, as you say, it is an Allied defeat. So I'll speak mainly about the British, although the Belgians and the Dutch were there too. Now, the British feel that while it's important to defend France, of course, as a forward defense of Britain, the British are very concerned about overcommitting to France because, and we might say quite reasonably, they think, well, if we put all our eggs in one basket, then what happens if it goes wrong? And so the French become very frustrated with the British that they are not committing more soldiers and more equipment to France. So by the end of 1939, the British have sent only 5 divisions of men to France. And funnily enough, when the war breaks out, the War Office in London doesn't even have an up-to-date map of France. Which perhaps goes to show perhaps the attitude in Britain to the defence of France.
That is extraordinary.
Yes, yeah. Well, just one of those little anecdotes that make them seem more human, I suppose. So they send 5 divisions to France, and they send 5 more divisions in 1940, but they're a bit reluctant, really, as I've said. And some historians have suggested, well, maybe they were reluctant because they wanted to defer to the French, so that because Gamelin is supreme commander, so that if the strategy turns out to be inadequate, they can maybe say, well, it wasn't really much to do with us. Now, in the air as well, Churchill is reluctant to commit RAF fighter squadrons to France, again, because these would be essential for the defense of Britain. And they do send some squadrons to France, but these were controlled from London, and they were often used to defend British troops on the ground, even when the French needed them more. Now, the RAF lost more planes in the Battle of France than it did in the Battle of Britain. So we should recognise that there was some commitment to it. But again, the French thought, why aren't you sending the whole RAF to France? The French think, well, your defence is, or our defence is your defence. And as one of the last ditch efforts of the British, which is again sounds very bizarre today, is that Churchill proposes to unite the countries of Britain and France in what he calls the Anglo-French Union, and what that would entail would be the fact that British citizens would also be citizens of France. So there would be a shared economy, shared war resources. We would have the same rights as the French over there. And it's sort of this one last attempt to keep the French in the war. And it's rejected by the French cabinet on the same day that Reynaud resigns. And one of the reasons it's rejected is that when it's suggested in cabinet, Marshal Pétain says, "Why should we fuse with a corpse?" Which is a great quote, I think, but it goes to show the attitude to Britain's chances after France has fallen.
Wow, yeah, that's quite the line as well. One thing that strikes me though is, was Britain not expecting then this continental war? Because one of the things that I suppose I've always guessed was that the mistake Britain and France made was they were expecting a replay of the First World War, which is what they didn't get. So am I kind of wrong there? Were Britain and France not expecting this to be like the Great War and a long attritional struggle in kind of northern France and Belgium?
Well, they didn't want that. I think that, I don't know if it's the case that they weren't expecting it. As I've said, one of the reasons they move into Belgium is to keep northeastern France free of fighting, and they think it will be a mobile war involving armor and tanks. But even if it breaks down into a war of attrition, the French are quite happy that that will take place in Belgium. Off French soil. So what I think the problem is that ultimately the Germans didn't play out the plan that the French and British had written for them. That's the problem. And they certainly didn't want a war like the First World War because it was so bloody and so costly. But again, it's all based on this fighting on a forward defense.
Let's then go to the divine surprise, as it was called. This idea that you had, as I called them, almost a fifth column of people in the French military and presumably politicians as well, who actually wanted the collapse of the French Third Republic, wanted the collapse of democracy, and so welcomed the opportunity to bring the war to a close and set up their regime. What did they want to happen? And then what actually did happen?
Okay, well, if we call them a fifth column, that sort of suggests that they're working maybe with the Nazis. But I think even these people on the extreme right in France, they still joined the army. They still fought against the Nazis. Even the leaders of the French fascist movements who had celebrated Nazism and celebrated Germany in the 1930s. They still fought, and often fought bravely. And I think the reason for that is, although they are sympathetic to Nazism, the one thing about fascists that we might all agree on is they are ultra nationalists. So they are French. They don't want to be enthralled to a foreign power. Now, so that we have these men on the extreme right, but we also have more conservative French politicians, and particularly army officers, who want to sweep away the Republic and establish this new regime in France to safeguard the French future, to remake the French along what they call traditional lines. So there's a heavy emphasis on things that we might think are typical of right-wing authoritarian regimes at this time. So emphasis on the peasantry, the land, the soil, the being a true French man or a true French woman in ethnic terms. And it's these men who found the Vichy regime. So the Vichy regime is founded on the 10th of July 1940. It's actually, at the basis of it, it is actually agreed to by the parliamentarians of the Third Republic. So the parliamentarians meet in a national assembly at Vichy, and they vote the Republic out of existence, and they vote to give Pétain full powers to revise the constitution, and then he concentrates all powers in his hands. So the ultimate outcome of the defeat is this right-wing, conservative and authoritarian regime, which falls far short of what some extremists in France want, these French fascists. But Hitler is quite happy. He's happy mainly for the reason that he doesn't really want fascists in charge in the occupied territories, because they will cause too much trouble. So he wants a compliant regime which will bend to his demands. And this conservative regime at Vichy, although it's not mildly conservative, it's very repressive and exclusionary in its conservatism. Hitler is happy for that to proceed. And I should add in that it's actually not a requirement of the Germans that this happens. So we could imagine that the Third Republic continued, and in Denmark there was a form of parliamentary government that did continue. So it's a French decision to get rid of the democracy and found this Vichy regime.
I didn't know that. I had always assumed it was kind of a puppet regime imposed on a defeated power. I didn't realize that it was a kind of active choice. What was their relationship like with the Germans? Like, for instance, northern France was occupied and it wasn't under Vichy administration. Did they kind of think, oh, well, we've got to put up with that for now? Or did they kind of think this is something we've really got to overcome?
Well, the agreement that the Germans and the French come to in the armistice of June 1940 is only ever meant to be a temporary agreement. So it's not actually a peace treaty to normalize relations. It's just a ceasefire. And that means that throughout the war, Vichy is constantly and desperately searching for this normalization of relations. So this partly informs the logic of collaboration. So Vichy thinks, well, if we help the Germans and if we give them what they ask for, we will get concessions back from them, and we will get a place in Hitler's table in this new order that he's building, which seems logical in 1940 because Britain is going to fall imminently. So that informs Vichy's attitude to collaboration. Germany's attitude is we will milk the French for everything we can get, and we don't care about them at all. But they are happy for the French to delude themselves, and so there is a tense relationship between the French and the Germans, particularly when the French don't think that they're getting back what they deserve in terms of concessions, but it's because they completely or misjudge the German relationship to collaboration. and to France. And you're right, that's the north half of France that is occupied in 1940. And then in 1942, when the Allies invade North Africa, the whole of the country is occupied. And Vichy continues, but it loses its justification for existing, really, in that Pétain says we were going to protect France from the Germans, but when the German soldiers are on the streets of southern France, it's exposed as a sham.
Yeah, and of course then the participants, not least Pétain himself, are vilified after the war as a result. Is he sentenced to death, but he isn't killed, is that right?
Yeah, he's sentenced to death at trial, but his death sentence is commuted by Charles de Gaulle, who has led the global opposition to Vichy and the Free French. It's commuted because, for one thing, Pétain is elderly. De Gaulle knows Pétain. They had sort of a teacher-student relationship during the 20s and 30s, although they eventually fell out. And because he's this national symbol, it's seen as not the right thing to do to execute him. He is in fact exiled to an island off the Atlantic coast of France, where he lives until, I think it's 1951. So he becomes very old and senile, and he's buried on this island. The other main leaders of Vichy, Pierre Laval, who was prime minister for a time of Vichy, he is executed. And Admiral Francois Darlan, who led Vichy as well as prime minister, he's assassinated in 1942. So Pétain leaves this complex legacy. And this was exposed actually in 2016 when the anniversary of the Battle of Verdun was coming up. The French government was concerned about how can we commemorate Verdun without mentioning Pétain. Should we dissociate the Pétain of Verdun from the Pétain of Vichy? And a lot of people were comfortable with that. However, when you take into account the Vichy regime's victims, I was less comfortable.
Yeah, it's always one of those tricky questions actually in history, and it's quite, I suppose, pertinent today. Well, I guess it's never not pertinent. Is how much you can separate out someone's life and the different stages and different things that they did, and can you ignore bad things and not good. And when you look at, like you say, the Vichy record, particularly as the war went on, in terms of the extent to which they were willing to hand people over to the Nazis, not least, of course, France's Jews, it's quite difficult to kind of still put that man on a pedestal.
Yeah, and Pétain was personally involved in the anti-Semitic policy too.
It must say, is there something with French kind of general leaders and being put on Atlantic islands?
Oh yes, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so let's think about this in the round then. I think what we kind of talked about at the start, about this being this giant clash of empires that had global repercussions, what then would you say are the great kind of takeaways, the consequences, the repercussions of this seismic event in 1940?
In terms of the actual war itself, and I suppose I'll speak from a very French perspective, is that what happens in northeast France in 1940 doesn't just affect the French nation within its European borders. So, for example, if you looked at a map of France in 1940, just the European part of France, someone might ask you, well, where is the other part of France? And of course, the other part of France is Algeria. Algeria is part of France in 1940. So you have then Morocco and Tunisia next to Algeria. You have French West Africa, Indochina, and lots of other territories scattered throughout the world, particularly in the Caribbean. And this defeat of France, we've talked about how it inspires colonial nationalists, but in the more short term, or from a more short term perspective, everything that Vichy legislates for, all its repression and exclusion, is applied throughout the world. So, for example, Jews in Madagascar are persecuted. There are literally a handful of Jews in Indochina who suffer persecution. Civil servants, Freemasons, communists are persecuted worldwide because of what happens in northeast France in 1940. So I think the thing that I think the takeaway from this is that it's not just the defeat of France in 1940. It doesn't just end with, oh, well, Hitler won and the French collaborated because they gave in. It's, as we've discussed, it's much more complex than that, but it has repercussions all across the globe too.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today and giving us such a kind of different insight, actually, on the Second World War, seeing it from a French perspective, seeing this event for the significant one it really is. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Peter.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris, so much for joining us. There will be a link to his book, France in the Second World War, down in the description. Make sure that you check that out. I have been Peter.
And I've been Alex. And thanks for listening.